Today, the government announced radical new plans to sell off the country's electricity industry. 20 years ago, the reactor at Dungeness heralded the false dawn of a new era of cheap electricity from nuclear power. But the biggest privatisation ever could leave Britain's nuclear industry entering the twilight.
I think the British nuclear industry is its most serious crisis in its history. Most of our nuclear power stations are now running towards the end of their lives. If the industry is going to be playing a significant role in the 21st century, they have to get building in soon. And I think it's very unlikely that they're going to build many nuclear power stations under privatisation, if they build any at all.
Now, I enshrined in the white paper at the beginning of it 6 principles.
The Department of Energy, lunchtime today. Cecil Parkinson unveils his bill to privatise the electricity industry, a multi-billion-pound sell-off that exposes the true economic costs of nuclear power. The bill leaves the nuclear business facing the biggest crisis in its history. By 1991, the CGB's 13 commercial nuclear power stations will be owned by a new private company, National Power. For the first time since it started, nuclear electricity will have to compete in the open market. Many experts believe that nuclear is simply not an economic proposition and that the bill could signal the end of the nuclear dream. For years, nuclear power has held out the promise of cheap electricity. We could all look forward to cheaper bills dropping through the letterbox. Throughout the 60s and 70s, in the economics of energy, nuclear electricity, it was argued, had a bright future. In 1983, even using calculations which favour the nuclear industry, the figures showed the average cost per unit from the early stations was 2.6 pence, as opposed to 2.38 pence for coal. For the newest nuclear station, Hinkley Point B, the unit cost was 2.64 pence, still more than Drax, the newest coal-fired station, with a unit cost of 2.46 pence. Today, privatisation has led to close scrutiny of the economics of nuclear power. It's brought criticism from right-wing economists like Alex Henney.
The British consumer has never had a single economic unit of electricity out of the nuclear power generators from the time they were built to now.
Free market supporters now find common ground with the industry's traditional critics like Walt Patterson, author of The Unofficial History of British Nuclear Power.
The industry has never got the technology right. It has yet to build a reactor on time or within budget, or one which worked up to its original design specifications. And the industry is now apparently having equal difficulty getting its arguments straight. And I think they're going to backfire on the industry.
At Sizewell in Suffolk, the site for the first of 4 new American-designed pressurised water reactors, planned for the future, part of the government's strategy to keep its energy options open. The same arguments have been made for this generation of nuclear power stations as with the others. Construction work started here 18 months ago. Sizewell B is due for completion in 1994, with it the same promise of cheap electricity from nuclear power.
These are the foundations for the reactor at Sizewell B. They were also to be the foundations for a new nuclear power programme. Yet, just 3 years after the Sizewell inquiry, it's clear that the economic case for this plant is in ruins. And it could well be that Sizewell B is the last nuclear power station to be built in Britain for the foreseeable future.
You would find it extremely difficult to find any banks or whatever to lend you the money to build a nuclear power station in any case, let alone to build a nuclear power station in a market as uncertain as the one which is being created by privatisation.
And even before privatisation, a House of Commons Energy Committee investigation earlier this year noted, "We are certainly persuaded that many of the critical assumptions that underlay the inquiry inspector's view that Sizewell B will be economic are no longer tenable." But the economics of Cottam, a coal-fired station in Derbyshire, are not in doubt. Coal prices have plummeted since the CGB presented its case to the Sizewell inquiry. Coal is now 3 times cheaper than they projected then and is expected to remain low, ready to fuel the profits of a privatised industry.
The low price of coal, however, is not the only problem for nuclear power as it's launched onto the market. There are other debits on the nuclear account which, when the industry was part of a public sector monopoly, were largely hidden. The bill says those costs must now be declared, and for the nuclear industry that could prove critical.
When it builds nuclear stations like Sizewell, the CEGB calculates for only a 5% return on the huge sums it invests in them. Private industry, however, will expect as much as a 15% return, and nuclear power does not provide that sort of reward. Also, there are other problems in the construction. They're seldom built on time or to cost. Sizewell was to be different. But Gordon McKerron, an energy economist in the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, thinks the signs are not good.
The main risk is that the capital, the construction costs of a new nuclear power station will be difficult to control and may turn out to be a lot more than you first thought. And a good example of this from recent British nuclear history is that the CEGB are now saying that the cost of building the Sizewell reactor will be at least £200 million more than it told the Sizewell inquiry that it would cost. And you have to remember that they've only just started building Sizewell, so this is not the final estimate of what it actually costs. It's just an interim estimate, and it's already a lot higher than it was thought only 3 or 4 years ago. There may or may not have been a large public health risk or public health disaster there, but what is absolutely sure about 3 Mile Island was that it was a financial disaster. You had an asset worth about $1 billion, and in a few hours of slightly poor design and poor operating practice, you could write off $1 billion and have an open-ended clean-up bill, which in itself is going to amount to several more $1 billion. That is not the kind of risk that investors normally like to take on.
Getting rid of radioactive waste are costs at the end of the nuclear fuel cycle that are well known, but they're not fully controllable. Once it leaves the reactor's temporary storage ponds, spent fuel has to be sent to Sellafield. Reprocessing and storing high-level waste can only be done here, where BNFL have a monopoly in the multi-billion-pound business of reprocessing.
The reprocessing of spent fuel to extract plutonium and uranium is also something that is subject to contracts which we can call cost plus. Whatever British Nuclear Fuels say it costs is what the customer pays, plus a profit for British Nuclear Fuels. So again, we can't know whether we can control reprocessing costs.
The South of Scotland Electricity Board fell victim to exactly this arrangement. In its latest accounts, a £12.7 million profit was turned into a £69.4 million loss because of additional charges from BNFL, a large part of which were for reprocessing and waste handling. And Britain's oldest Magnox reactor is due to be decommissioned next year. At Sellafield, they're trying to find out how to do it. This experimental reactor is 1/10 the size of Barclay. Nobody in the world has ever decommissioned a full-scale commercial reactor. The CEGB estimate the cost for Barclay will be £300 million. Future costs could be so great, they say, it would be cheaper to mothball them for 100 years. Decommissioning, then, is fraught with uncertainty for both scientist and investor.
The £300 million is predominantly the cost of chopping them up, of dismantling them and returning the site to the so-called greenfield condition. And CEGB's policy is that you wait 100 years before you reach that final stage, and in the meantime, of course, the costs are much less. Whether that will prove to be environmentally acceptable is quite another question, and whether it might not damage the general can-do image of the nuclear industry to actually leave something and admit for 100 years you don't know quite what to do with it, is something that might, even from a public relations point of view within the industry, be rather a bad thing.
The bill gives the Secretary of State powers to give direct grants or Treasury loans to cover the enormous cost of waste disposal, storage, reprocessing and decommissioning to the tune of £2.5 billion. In addition, there's to be a non-fossil fuel quota requiring the privatised distribution companies to buy 15 to 20% of their energy from nuclear power. If it proves more expensive than electricity from coal, the consumer is to pick up the bill.
In all, it's a package that it's hoped will guarantee that the investor gets a good deal.
But that good deal is going to be at the expense of the consumers and the taxpayer. Let us be absolutely clear. There is no prospect on the current sorts of costs of building and operating nuclear power stations and building and operating coal stations that nuclear power can compete with power from coal.
It seems inevitable that there will be a cost for supporting nuclear power, and the domestic consumer and the taxpayer will pick up the bill. Industry is apprehensive too. 2 price rises have already been announced to fatten up electricity for privatisation. At the steelworks in Rotherham, there's concern at what further price rises would mean for business.
When the privatisation was announced, at the same time it was announced that we would be faced with 15% increase. 9% we've already had this April, another 6% next April. That's 15%. 15% is £7 million on our bill. That's 25% of our sales margin. If you put it another way, it's £1,000 poll tax per employee in the steel division. And if we were going to make up for that in increased productivity, we would have to sack another 500 people. Now, why should they pass their inefficient costs on to us? Our customers don't accept inefficiency as far as our prices are concerned, because we have to compete with the Germans and the French and everybody else.
The customer is bound to bear some of industry's extra costs. But what's not known is how much might have to be paid for construction overruns.
A cost overrun on a nuclear power station is a very, very serious thing. You can run into hundreds of millions of pounds just with a few years' delay. And if they run into any real disasters trying to build PWRs, then you are certainly talking about very serious money.
The government is backing nuclear power for strategic energy reasons.
It stood us in very good stead. For instance, it saw us through the oil price shock. It saw us through a miners' strike. Without nuclear, we would almost certainly have had to cave into Mr. Scargill. So we've had our own personal experiences or national experiences in the last decade or so which have emphasized the importance of nuclear. And of course, the basic nuclear argument doesn't change. Fossil fuels are becoming more and more scarce. They are finite, nobody denies that. And there is no alternative source of electricity, baseload electricity, on the horizon at the moment.
Concern over the greenhouse effect is another reason why the government is backing nuclear power. But critics are not impressed by this recent greening of the government.
I believe it's either misguided or, in fact, it's a cynical exercise to resuscitate an ailing nuclear power industry. Let's put it in perspective. The most that nuclear can do is to replace all of the coal-fired power stations, which constitute about 14 to 15% of the total global warming problem. Energy efficiency is the only solution. There are no supply options, whether it is nuclear power or building wind parks, that can actually deliver the energy that's required to displace coal. You can't do it. All the analysis that's been done in the United States and in the UK demonstrates that the quickest and most cost-effective way in actually reducing our use of fossil fuel is energy efficiency.
This privatisation has presented Cecil Parkinson with a delicate political problem. The arguments may be stacked against nuclear power, but the industry has a firm friend in the Prime Minister. Mrs Thatcher's commitment is shared by Environment Secretary Nicholas Ridley.
Nicholas Ridley has called for a massive expansion of nuclear capacity. Do you think that that's necessary or indeed practical?
He's saying worldwide.
I don't think he was, actually.
Well, he was, yes.
We don't want to get an argument, but if you look at the transcript of the interview he gave, he's quite clearly speaking about Britain.
Well, he's and I have talked about it, and he says that he was talking about worldwide. Because we have been settling the programme for Britain, and the programme for Britain is, as I said. But the point Nicholas was making was a very important one. He was saying that fossil fuels are the great pollutant. I don't know if you realise it, but up our chimneys of our power stations last year, we sent out nearly 250 million tonnes of untreated carbon dioxide. and a lot of other emissions too.
How many new nuclear power stations do you foresee being built?
I, as I said, foresee the case for nuclear making itself. What we as a government have said, before we were elected last time, and those who elected us knew it, we're going to maintain the nuclear program, and we're maintaining it at about its present level. We're doing it for 20 years. During that, we're going to expose all the facts, by the way.
But at the end of this 20-year
We're
period,
going, but,
how many
but
new
we're
nuclear
going to
power
let the
stations do you
people
foresee
know,
being
for the
built?
first time, the British people are going to have a nuclear program in legislation, and they're going to know what the costs of that decision are. We're not going to fudge them, we're not going to hide them. And we believe that as the environmental, as the economic, as the fossil fuel argument starts to develop, we believe that the market will turn to nuclear.
But there are grave doubts as to whether nuclear power could survive in a truly competitive free market. In countries where there are private nuclear utilities, experience shows that it's suffered a grim fate.
No privately owned utility in Europe has ordered a nuclear power station without subsequently cancelling it since 1975. And if you look at the countries which are still pressing ahead with nuclear power, which are France, the USSR and Japan, they're all electricity markets where competition plays no part whatsoever. And in the case certainly of the USSR and France, the industry is completely dominated by the state. But in countries where there is a private sector electricity industry, nuclear power has long since faded away.
In privatising the electricity industry, the government has seen two of its most cherished policies collide. It's been difficult to reconcile enthusiasm for the free market with a commitment to nuclear power. The irony is that a government that has long favoured the nuclear industry may have brought the nuclear dream to an end.